Welcome to Law and Society in Taiwan. And our topic for today is climate change and sustainable development, a very important topic since all of us are feeling the effects and impacts of climate change. Let's start with the big picture. So, when we are talking about climate change and sustainable development, the milestone event happened in 1992, so that was 30 years ago. So, what happened in 1992? The United Nations held a big conference on environment and development in South America in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This meeting was also called the Earth Summit, and the result of this big meeting was the Agenda 21. So that was an action plan on sustainable development. At the same time, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was opened for signature. So we are going to talk about this. And this framework convention was later complemented by a series of additional agreements. For example, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, and then in 2009, the Copenhagen Accord, and very important, 2015, the United Nations again held a summit on sustainable development in New York. And the result of this summit was called the 2030 Agenda. And the uh, at the core of this agenda are the 17 sustainable development goals, which you can see here on this slide. And the goal number 13 specifically talks about climate change. Later, in the same year, in 2015, the Paris Agreement then was also signed. And in 2021, the Glasgow Climate Pact was signed. So this was one of the latest agreements to be taken here in with regard to climate change. So these are the international trends that are important as a background knowledge if you want to understand the development in Taiwan. And the development in Taiwan, we can see here on the right hand side. Very important to mention here, one of the earliest laws that relate to climate change and sustainable development was the Basic Environment Act, which was adopted in 2002. In 2009, the Renewable Energy Development Act was enacted and amended in 2019. Probably the most important climate law in Taiwan was adopted in 2015 and is called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Act, which is now currently being revised. For example, they want to change the name, yeah, to Climate Change Response Act. So in 2021, the Environmental Protection Agency opened a new office for climate change, who drafted this new bill, and this new bill is now being reviewed by the Legislative Yuan. So let's talk about these important developments in more detail. 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the text was drafted and adopted in New York and then opened for signature at the UN conference in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This agreement then became effective in 1994 and currently has 198 parties. So that's almost all the nations on Earth. With the exception of Taiwan. So Taiwan is not a signatory party, uh, because Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. However, Taiwan has been participating as a non governmental organization and also is committed to comply with the UNFCCC. So Taiwan has adopted a policy of voluntary compliance, even though Taiwan is not formally bound by this UN agreement. So if we read the preamble of the UNFCCC, it says that human activities have been increasing the greenhouse gases, and the greenhouse effect will result in a warming of the atmosphere, which will adversely affect natural ecosystems and humankind. So here in the preamble, we see the problem. The problem are the greenhouse gases that are produced by us humans and which have an adverse effect and produce the so-called global warming. So the global nature of climate change calls for the widest possible cooperation by all countries. This is the solution that is stated in the preamble of the UNFCCC. It calls for global cooperation. And more specifically, we need to achieve sustainable social and economic development, energy efficiency, and the application of new technologies. So this is what we have to do and how we can solve the problem. Article 1 of the UNFCCC now talks about the definitions. So, how is climate change defined? It is defined as human activity that alters the global atmosphere in addition to natural climate variability. It is important here to note the difference between climate and weather. So, the weather, of course, can change every day, that's natural. But the climate is something more long lasting. That's happening, yeah, over many years, and we note that the climate here is changing, has been changing over the past years. So this is not just the weather that's changing, but more generally and more long lastingly, the climate. Article 2 next talks about the objective. The objective of this treaty, the UNFCCC, is the stabilization of the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. This word anthropogenic means human induced. So anthro means human, and genic means produced. Yeah, so this is a Greek word, and it means produced or induced by humans. Yeah, so it's the humans who are interfering with the climate in a dangerous way, and so therefore it is important now to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Article 3 now talks about the principles. One is to protect the climate system for the present and future generations of humankind, which means we have a common but differentiated responsibility. This means, why is it called common but differentiated? So, common means all of us are responsible to protect the climate, but the responsibility is differentiated, meaning the developed countries should lead in combating climate change. Why? Because it's the developed countries who produced all those greenhouse gas emissions in the first place. And therefore, the industrialized or developed countries have the primary responsibility now, and also to help the developing countries. So this is called the common but differentiated responsibilities. Yeah, it's a different responsibility that the industrialized countries have versus the developing countries. Another principle here is when there is a threat of a serious or irreversible damage, and even though we lack full scientific certainty, but that should not be a reason for postponing the measures. So basically, this is called a precautionary principle. Precautionary means we have to be careful. Yeah, so when the damage is really huge, very serious, and irreversible, then we really have to be careful, and we have to take precaution, even if we might not be 100% sure. But this should not be a reason, this should not be an excuse. Yeah, we have to take precautionary measures. Article 4 of the UNFCCC talks about the commitments. So the commitments are to make national emission inventories. An inventory is a complete list that shows how many greenhouse gas emissions are being produced. And then to use comparable methodologies also to when calculating these greenhouse gases. Yeah, so here the commitment is to make transparent and to report the greenhouse gas emissions in each country, and then to mitigate and to adapt. Mitigate, this word means to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. But it is important to note here that the UNFCCC does not fix a binding target. Yeah, so it only mentions that the signatory parties are committed to mitigate, but they don't really specify the amount, how much of greenhouse gas emissions should be reduced. But to give an example for mitigation, yeah, how can we mitigate? Well, if you want to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions, a very simple way would be not to drive. So instead of driving the car, we walk. Yeah, this way we won't produce any greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation now means we have to adjust. So if we cannot really prevent greenhouse gas emissions, then at least we have to adapt or to adjust to the consequences. To give an example, we cannot totally avoid greenhouse gas emissions, but what we can do in order to adjust to the consequences of climate change is, for example, to try to prevent the flooding. Yeah, for example, Taiwan is an island, so when the ocean so the surface of the ocean increases and there are increased risks of floods, then we have to think of methods how to prevent floods. Yeah, or another example, climate change also leads to droughts. So often, when there are long periods where there is no rain, then we have to think of a way to collect the rainwater once it rains. Yeah, so this would be an example for adaptation measures. Other commitments are to take climate change into account in social, economic, and environmental policies, to do research, scientific research. Education, of course, is very important, and the developed countries shall provide financial resources and transfer technology to the developing countries. Yeah, so here this is also very important. Yeah, to provide finance, money, and also the technology to the developing countries. Article 7 talks about the conference of the parties, yeah, the COPs, conference of the parties. So, the conference of the parties are the supreme body of this convention, and they will regularly review the UNFCCC for the effective implementation. Yeah, so the UNFCCC is a framework convention, which means it's a general agreement, but later on regularly, the parties to the UNFCCC, they will meet again, they will come again and discuss and review the implementation of the UNFCCC. And so this is called the Conference of the Parties then. Article 22 talks about the accession. So, who can become a member of the UNFCCC? So, these are the states and also regional economic integrations or organizations, such as the European Union, which is also a signatory member of the UNFCCC. So, these are the most important cornerstones of the UNFCCC, and here are some test questions now. So, what does UNFCCC mean? And is Taiwan legally bound by the UNFCCC? What is the difference between mitigation and adaptation? Give examples for each. Now we can move on to 1997. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in Japan. As I mentioned, the Conference of the Parties would come together again to discuss the UNFCCC, and this is what happened in 1997 in Kyoto. So, Kyoto is a city in Japan, and the agreement that was taken there is therefore called the Kyoto Protocol. The Protocol became effective in 2005 and currently has 192 parties. Kyoto Protocol is so important. Why? Because it sets a binding target for the first time. As I mentioned, the UNFCCC itself did not specify a target, but this is what happened now in 1997 in Article 3 of the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah, it says the parties in Annex 1 and the parties in Annex 1 of the UNFCCC are the industrialized countries and also certain economies in transition and the European Union. But basically, most of them are industrialized countries. Yeah, so these are the Annex 1 parties. They shall not exceed the greenhouse gases listed in the Annex A, and they shall limit or reduce their emissions according to amounts that are specified in Annex B. So here, for the first time, we now have the binding targets for the 37 industrialized countries, the Annex 1 parties. So this is very important to note that the Kyoto Protocol actually only has binding commitments for the industrialized countries, whereas the developing countries are not bound. Yeah, they are encouraged to take voluntary actions, but they are not bound by binding targets. And this is also a reason why, for example, the United States later did not ratify the Kyoto Protocol. Yeah, so they thought this is not fair that only the industrialized countries are bound by this agreement. So, how much do the Annex 1 countries have to reduce their emissions? At least 5% below the 1990 levels. So, this was agreed for the first commitment period from 2008 to 2012. The second commitment period, lasting from 2013 to 2020, then was later agreed in 2012 at the Doha agreement. They later agreed to reduce at least 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Now that we have these specific targets, how can we meet these targets? And here, in order to give the parties some flexibility, we have three market mechanisms that are laid down in Article 6, 12, and 17. So, Article 6 says for the purpose of meeting the commitments under Article 3, yeah, namely to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by at least 5%. Any party included in Annex 1, and as I mentioned, these are generally the developed countries, may transfer to or acquire from any other such party. So again, here we refer to the developed countries. Emission reduction units resulting from projects aimed at reducing anthropogenic emissions. So basically, here this talks about the generation, the transfer, and the acquisition of emission reduction units. So this kind of market mechanism here, this is called joint implementation. And this instrument is a project to reduce or remove emissions in another developed country. So here, the joint implementation takes place between a developed country and another developed country. That's why it's called joint implementation. So the participants of this kind of project are Annex 1 parties, yeah, so only the developed countries. Yeah, and one example would be to provide foreign investment or to transfer technology to another developed country, and then in this way, I myself, this country, yeah, can also receive the emission reduction units. The second instrument is called a Clean Development Mechanism and is laid down in Article 12 of the Kyoto Protocol. And this is to assist parties not included in Annex 1 to achieve sustainable development. And it helps the parties that are included in Annex 1 to comply with their commitments under Article 3. So here we see Here we have two parties. One party is an Annex 1 party, so a developed country that wants to comply with its commitment of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to do so now, they can implement an emission reduction project in another country that is a developing country, so a non Annex 1 country. So, give you an example. If a developed country wants to help a developing country, how can they do it? For example, by assisting with a rural electrification project using solar panels. So a developed country would install the solar panels in a developing country, and in this way receive the certified emission reductions for itself. And then in this way, it can offset its own emissions and thereby comply with the emission limitation commitments. So you see the difference, the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, is a project between a developed country and a developing country, whereas the joint implementation is a project between two developed countries. And the third market mechanism that allows the parties more flexibility is called emission trading. So what happens here is that parties in Annex B may participate in emission trading for purposes of fulfilling their commitments under Article 3. Yeah, so again, the parties who have to reduce their emissions can do so by trading with their emission allowances. Yeah, so each party receives certain emission allowances, and if they exceed these allowances, they can buy on the market, on the emission market, or on the other hand, if they manage to reduce their emissions, so they have some surplus allowances left, then they can sell the surplus allowances to another country who has emitted more and needs to buy more greenhouse gas allowances. Yeah, so here we see basically the emissions, in particular CO2, is these allowances are like a certificate that can be traded on the market. So this takes us now to the next agreement, 2009, the Copenhagen Accord. Accord means agreement. This agreement was adopted by the Conference of the Parties 15 in Denmark. And this agreement is not legally binding, but it is important because the political leaders met in Denmark, and therefore this agreement has political significance at the highest level. The Copenhagen Accord now applies not only to the Annex 1 parties, namely in the industrialized countries, but also to the non-Annex 1 parties, so also to the developing countries. Yeah, and we see this in paragraph 5 of the Copenhagen Accord, where it says the non Annex 1 parties to the convention, meaning the UNFCCC, will implement mitigation actions submitted to the Secretariat in a format given in Appendix 2, and these mitigation actions will be subject to verification. Here you now see the difference. The previous agreement, the UNFCCC, had no binding target. The Copenhagen Accord was only binding for the Annex 1 parties, and now the Copenhagen Accord also very specifically targets the non-Annex 1 parties, so the developing countries. And the implementation of this Copenhagen Accord shall be assessed by the year 2015. So that was why in 2015 the expectations were big, yeah, and then the result was the 2015 Paris Agreement. It was adopted at the Conference of the Parties 21 in France and is effective since 2016. Currently, it has 193 parties. The Paris Agreement is important because it sets the long term temperature goals and defines them in Article 2 as an increase in global average temperature shall be limited to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably even lower, namely 1.5 degrees Celsius. So now we have a clear long term temperature goal. Article 3 talks about the nationally determined contributions or the NDCs, meaning that all parties shall determine their national contributions, and these contributions shall be ambitious. The parties here can set their goals by themselves and voluntarily and shall communicate their nationally determined contributions then every 5 years, and the goals that each party sets shall be increasingly ambitious. And then overall, the overall assessment or global stocktake then shall take place for the first time in 2023 and every 5 years thereafter. So here we see a clear cycle of 5 years, namely the nationally determined contributions are targets that are set by the parties for a period of 5 years, and also the global stocktake or global assessment shall take place then every 5 years. And as a result, recommendations can then be given to the parties for the next round of nationally determined contributions. Article 15 talks about the implementation and compliance mechanism. And here it establishes an expert committee. And the goal here is to be transparent, however, not to punish. So the expert committee here is non adversarial and is not going to impose a penalty. Article 16 is important, is interesting for Taiwan because it talks about who can be admitted as an observer. And it says any body or agency, it can be national or international, governmental or non governmental, qualified in matters covered by this agreement, namely climate change, who wishes to be represented as an observer may be admitted unless at least one third of the parties who are present object to the admission or participation of the observers. For your reference, I recommend here two videos that are published by the official United Nations climate change homepage, and they explain what is the Paris Agreement. So we now move on to the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact, which was signed last year at the Conference of the Parties 26 in Scotland, United Kingdom. And in this climate pact, now the focus already is to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we are no more talking about 2 degrees Celsius, but it has become clear that it is important to set an even more ambitious goal, namely the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires rapid, deep, and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, reducing global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by the year 2030. So here the emphasis is that we need to reduce more rapidly our greenhouse gas emissions. However, what is the truth? The reality is, if we take into account so far the implementation of the nationally determined contributions, that the aggregate greenhouse gas emission levels are actually increasing, and it's even estimated, yeah, that by the year 2030, yeah, instead of reducing by 45%, it's actually increasing by 14%. So this is the sad fact that uh, that was recognized here in this climate pact. Also, when it comes to financing, the fact is that there is not enough financing, even though the developed countries have promised to provide 100 billion US dollars per year by the year 2020. But again, here the fact is so far only about 80 billion instead of the 100 billion have been provided to the developed countries. And also, it is interesting to note that most of the financing is now being provided in forms of loans instead of grants. And the difference, obviously, is grant is something that the developed countries can just keep the money; they can just keep, whereas the loans is something they would have to repay. Yeah, so this can a little bit risky, of course. Also here, the fact that the loans are actually increasing instead of providing the grants. The Glasgow Pact also stresses uh, the important role of financial institutions, yeah, and urges them to scale up the investments in climate actions and to increase the grants and to provide other highly concessional forms of finance. So this is what I also just mentioned. Yeah, it would be important to give more grants, yeah, not instead of the loans. Very important to stress is the role of the banks as the gatekeepers of money. Yeah, so we know where does all the money come from. When we need money, we traditionally go to the banks. Yeah, and so banks, or more generally, the financial institutions here have a important role to control the flow of money. Yeah, it's the banks who decide who gets the money, the investment, yeah, for certain climate related projects. The next conference of the parties is soon coming up in November this year, 2022. And this year we are also celebrating the 30th anniversary of the UNFCCC. And it's going to be a critical meeting because, as we know, that climate change is becoming an existential threat. We are feeling the impacts. We are reading the reports every day now in the news. We are having the heat waves, we are having the droughts in many parts of the world. So it's really going to be a critical time, and we will see whether the leaders will manage to take decisive actions to transform, to achieve the sustainability transformation. So much to the international trends as a background knowledge. And this is important for us to understand the developments in Taiwan. Um, so let's turn to the Taiwanese part now. And in Taiwan, we have to go back 20 years. 20 years ago, in 2002, a very important law was enacted, namely the Basic Environment Act. And this Basic Environment Act states the purpose, namely, among others, also to pursue sustainable development. So here we have it, the term sustainable development. And this term is defined in Article 2 expressly as the ability to satisfy contemporary needs. Contemporary means the current needs, without sacrificing the ability of future generations to satisfy their needs. So, sustainable development means we want to develop our economy now, but we also have to take into account the future generations. Also, the term environment is explained here in Article 2 in a very broad manner. And for example, it also includes natural ecological systems. So, this Basic Environment Act is a very general and very broad act. Question: is there a legal definition for the term sustainable development? If so, explain the relevant provision. A very important provision of the Basic Environment Act is Article 3 because it stresses that economic, technological, and social development shall equally emphasize environmental protection based on long term national interests. And in the event economic, technological, or social development has seriously and negative impact on the environment, protection of the environment shall prevail. So here we have the equality between the economy and the environment. And if there is a serious impact on the environment, then what is more important? Is the economy more important or the environment? And according to this Article 3, it says the environment is more important. It shall prevail. So this might be quite surprising to have this kind of provision in the law itself. And we find a similar provision in the constitution of the Republic of China in Taiwan, namely in Article 10 of the additional articles. And it says environmental and ecological protection shall be given equal consideration with economic and technological development. So again, here we have the equality between the environment on the one hand and the economy on the other hand. Article 4 of the Basic Environment Act talks about the responsibilities. So, who is responsible for protecting the environment? And the answer here is it's a joint or shared duty or responsibility, namely the citizens, the enterprises, and the government entities at all levels. And this is specified in the following Articles 5, 6, and 21. So, according to Article 5, citizens shall practice green consumption. According to Article 6, the enterprises shall promote clean production. And according to Article 21, the government entities at all levels shall actively adopt measures to control carbon dioxide emissions and establish plans to mitigate the greenhouse gas effect. Article 21 here is particularly important because it expressly mentions the need to mitigate the greenhouse effect and to control the carbon dioxide emissions. And in this respect, the Basic Environment Act also is directly related to the climate law. In terms of green consumption and clean production, here you see at the right hand side the labels, the green labels or certificates. So next time you buy a product, take a look. Does it have the CO2 emission label that tells you how much carbon intensive this product was in the course of its production? Or maybe the next time you buy a wash machine, does it have the water saving label and the other green labels here? Article 4 here also mentions that those who pollute or destroy the environment shall be responsible for the harm or risk they create. So the question is who shall be responsible if there is a harm? And the answer is those who pollute, those who destroy. And this is also called the polluter pays principle. We'll mention this important principle again later on. Next question. Does the Constitution of the Republic of China in Taiwan mention environmental protection? If so, explain the relevant provision. According to Article 3 of the Basic Environment Act, what has priority? Environmental protection or economic development? Do you think this provision is being implemented in practice? According to the Basic Environment Act, who has a duty to protect the environment? Give examples how these duties can be implemented in practice. Next, it is important to mention Article 23 of the Basic Environment Act. It stipulates the government shall establish plans to gradually achieve the goal of becoming a nuclear free country. So, here we have it in the law itself, the vision of a nuclear free country, and it tells us that it is justified that in the future the nuclear plants will be shut down. So this is a vision that's enshrined in the basic environment law. Article 28 here mentions the polluter pays principle, which I just explained. Yeah, so it means those who pollute or destroy the environment shall pay. Yeah, so it's not the general public who shall pay, but it's those enterprises who pollute or destroy the environment. According to Article 29, the Executive Yuan shall establish a National Sustainable Development Commission, which is composed of government representatives, academics, experts, and civic groups. And indeed, this has been established and it's now called the National Council for Sustainable Development. And you can take a look at their homepage here. Question: does the Basic Environment Act mention nuclear energy? If so, explain the relevant provision. According to the Basic Environment Act, who is in principle responsible for environmental pollution? How can this principle be implemented in practice? Do you agree with this principle? Next, we move on to the Renewable Energy Development Act of 2009, and this law was recently revised in 2019. The purpose of this law is energy diversification to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to enhance sustainable development. So, what does this mean, energy diversification? Let's compare this with the traditional forms of energies that we have in Taiwan. And in this context, I have to mention the Energy Administration Act from the year 1980 and last revised in 2016. This Energy Administration Act defines energy and says it includes petroleum, coal, natural gas, nuclear fuel, electrical energy, and other forms of energy. So, the transformation strategy now in Taiwan is that coal in the future shall be reduced, obviously, because it produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So, the plan is no more new coal fired power plants in the future. Instead, coal shall be replaced by natural gas. So the plan is to increase the natural gas. And with regard to nuclear, I already mentioned the plan is to deactivate the existing nuclear power plants and in the future to realize the vision of a nuclear free homeland. And instead, we want to expand the renewable powers, in particular solar power and wind power in Taiwan. And the specific targets here are 20% renewable energies by the year 2025 and 50% of renewable energies by the year 2050. Article 3 defines the term renewable energy, and list them in more detail. Yeah, and here we see we have, for example, solar and biomass, uh, which is made of vegetation or organic waste. Then we have geothermal energy, which comes from below the surface of the earth, such as the steams, yeah, or the hot springs. Then we have the ocean energy that is derived from the sea waves, the currents, the tides. Very important in Taiwan, also the wind power and the hydrogen energy. In Article 6, we have clear promotion objectives for renewable energy power generation, namely 27 million kilowatts by the year 2025. Yeah, so the plan of the government here is to make Taiwan a hub or a center for green energy in Asia, because we know that Asia more generally, and according to market research, will be a big market for offshore wind energy, in particular in the future. Of course, it's important in this context also to take into account the stable power supply. So, even if we promote the renewable energy, we have to make sure that the power supply is stable. Question: how is energy defined according to Article 2 of the Energy Administration Act? And what are the future prospects for these traditional sources of energy? How is renewable energy defined according to the Renewable Energy Development Act? And what are the future prospects for these renewable sources of energy? What form of renewable energy do you prefer, and would you be willing to pay a higher price? Give reasons for your answer. So obviously in Taiwan, we know that the prices for electricity are very low compared with other countries. And the question here is, would you be willing to pay a higher price? And do you think that raising energy prices would be a reasonable and effective tool to combat climate change? Give reasons for your answer. Now we talk about the most important climate law that is currently in force in Taiwan. And this law is called Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Act, and it was promulgated in the year 2015. Article 1 expressly reveals that this law was passed in response to climate change concerns. So, this law is the first in Taiwan to specifically focus and combat climate change. According to Article 2, the Executive Yuan's Environmental Protection Administration, the EPA, is the competent authority at the central government level. And according to Article 4, the long term national greenhouse gas emission reduction goal is to reduce 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. But this goal can be adjusted, taking into account the UNFCCC agreements and the other international conventions and decisions. Yeah, so here we see the effort of Taiwan to comply with the international trends. Article 5 talks about the legal and policy principles and mentions expressly the principle of energy security, or the vision of a nuclear free homeland, which is also enshrined in the Basic Environmental Act, or the user charge principle, yeah, also called the polluter pays principle, which we already mentioned. Yeah, so it's those who pollute the environment that they have to pay, and not the general public. Well, the principle of equality and social welfare is also increasingly important, because we know that climate change will affect different parts of society in different ways. And here, efforts have to be undertaken to ensure equality and social welfare. And then other principles are to achieve the green transformation, yeah, to achieve green economies, green industry, green technology, and very important also the principle of resource efficiency and recycling. So let's talk about this in more detail. And this is also mentioned up here, yeah, that the government shall ensure sustainable utilization of the nation's resources. Why is this so important? Well, it's so important because Taiwan is highly reliant on on imported resources. So more than 70% of the resources and more than 90% of the energy is actually imported. And that is why it's important for Taiwan to make more efforts to be more self-sufficient. And here it is a very interesting comparison that former President Lee Teng-hui proposed for Taiwan. Yeah, a comparison that Taiwan should be like an ark. An ark is a ship, and perhaps you know the story of from the Bible, where it started to rain, yeah, for many weeks, and therefore God instructed Noah, who was a good man, to build an ark. Yeah, so the ark here was a ship, and Noah built the ark, and then in this ark, he Noah and his family and all the animals he took with him managed to survive the long period of rain, the floodings. So the ark is a symbol for self-sufficiency, and the same applies to Taiwan. Taiwan should also try to become more self-sufficient by adopting the magic formula of a circular economy. Circular economy now is the hot word, and let's compare this with the traditional concept. So the traditional concept was linear, where the enterprises would produce and then the consumers would use and consume the products, and then in the end there would be an enormous amount of waste. This is the linear economy. The new concept now, circular economy, means we want to have green production in the first place. Yeah, so when we produce, it should be environmentally friendly and low emissions. Then the consumption should also be green, meaning that the consumers should buy products that are highly efficient and environmentally friendly. And then instead of throwing away the products, we should try to reuse them. And if this is not possible, to recycle. And this means that waste management is going to play a very important role here. So the waste is like gold. It is again the source for new resources, for new materials that can be used again for the green production, or it can be turned into energy. And here you have an example. Many of you probably collect or recycle the plastic bottles. And then what happens with the plastic bottles? Yeah, they are crushed, and then the plastic material here becomes the source for a new material, and then we can produce textiles or clothes out of it, or produce new products such as recycled products, and then the cycle begins again. So this is an example for circular economy. Question: explain what circular economy means. Do you think this is a good concept? Give reasons. Now, I would like to recommend to you to study the case of MiniWiz. MiniWiz is a company that is headquartered in Taiwan, and here you see the homepage. It was founded by Arthur Huang, who is also the CEO of this company. He's a native Taiwanese who emigrated to the United States and is now doing projects from all over the world. So he's very famous now because he is advising how to transform trash into cash, and the magic word here is upcycling. And he explains what upcycling means. So normally we talk about recycling, but what he means here with upcycling is that the products that he makes out of trash have a higher value, and therefore it's called upcycling. And there are many inspiring videos about this company. Many magazines and journals from all over the world, such as Wall Street Journal or BBC, CNN, The Economist, and others have written about this company. And also in Taiwan, recently there was an interesting interview with the founder of this company. So I highly recommend watching one of these videos, and then you will exactly understand what circular economy means. Question: explain at least three important principles to combat climate change mentioned in Article 5 of the 2015 Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Law. Article 8 of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Act lists a list of actions that shall be taken, starting with energy, renewable energy, and then transportation management, green buildings, waste recycling, forest management and agriculture, green financing, cap and trade schemes, technologies and education, etc. So you can take a look at this long list and think about which of these actions do you consider most important. Article 9 also talks about the publication of a national climate change action guideline. And in fact, these action guidelines were published in 2017. And these action guidelines shall be reviewed every 5 years. And their goals shall also be set on a 5 year basis. So, does this remind you of something, that 5 years? Well, when I was talking about the Paris Agreement, you might remember, the Paris Agreement also talks about the 5 year cycles for the nationally determined contributions and the global stock takes or the global assessments. So, obviously, Taiwan here is complying also with the international trends, and therefore also adopting these 5 year cycles for its action plans. Now let's talk about the cap and trade scheme, which is a form of flexible market mechanism that is particularly mentioned in the Kyoto Agreement and also now being practiced in Taiwan. What happens here is the Competent Authority designates first the emission sources and then distributes or allocates the emission allowances to these enterprises. Yeah, so the each enterprise has a certain amount of emissions that they are allowed to emit. So all the enterprises, they should not exceed the amount of the allowance. But what if they do? If they do exceed the allowances, meaning that they emit more than they are allowed to emit, then they would have to procure additional emission allowances and then thereby offset the excess emissions. So this is interesting to note, right? That in Taiwan we do already have also this kind of emission trading, and the major sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Taiwan are in the following fields, namely power generation, steel, cement, and semiconductor, to give some examples. These enterprises are obliged to make an inventory of their emissions, and these amounts will then be verified and registered. And here you see the homepage of the Taiwan's National Greenhouse Gas Registry. Um, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has moreover published the greenhouse gas offset regulations. So, this is to give you an example for offsetting. Offsetting means you want to compensate for your emissions, and you can do this. For example, here we have the example of a pig farm that collects the biogas for energy generation and also installs the solar panels on its rooftops. So offsetting is a kind of balancing. Yeah, on the one hand, you produce the emissions, and then on the other hand, you do something that will reduce the emissions, and in this way, offset your emissions. And here is the homepage, the website of the greenhouse gas reduction offset website. Yeah, where the enterprises can register and offset their emissions. And Article 29, moreover, stipulates that the owner, user, or manager of a covered emission source can be fined up to 2 million Taiwan dollars. And in severe circumstances, the operation of the business can even be suspended. Question. Article 8 of the 2015 Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Law lists numerous actions to combat climate change. Explain three actions that you consider to be most important. Well, I've now explained the most important climate law that applies in Taiwan. And now, what do you think is the international perspective? How can we rank Taiwan in comparison with other countries? And here we have a climate change performance index, which was published in November 2021 by German Watch, a non-governmental organization based in Germany, and they assess the climate change performance of 60 countries and also of the entire European Union. And this covers 92% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So, what are the results for Taiwan? Well, not so good. In fact, the four categories that are being assessed, namely the greenhouse gas emissions, the renewable energy, the energy use, and the climate policy, have all been ranked very low or low for Taiwan. So Taiwan here actually ranks at the bottom. It's among the bottom 10 nations in the world. What's the reason? So the critique here is that Taiwan lacks concrete strategies and monitoring mechanisms that should accompany the carbon reduction targets. Yeah, so Taiwan has climate ambitions. We do have interesting climate policies, but we have to strengthen the monitoring and the implementation. So we need the concrete strategies so we can really implement and realize these policies. So obviously, we have to do even more, and this is, in fact, what the EPA has been pushing for. So the Environmental Protection Agency in 2021 opened a specialized office of climate change. So now we have a special office that focuses on climate change, and they drafted the Climate Change Response Act. So this is now a bill. It is not a law yet, but it is currently being reviewed by the Legislative Yuan. And in fact, it is a revision of the 2015 Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Act, but the name will be changed to Climate Change Response Act. Also, when it comes to this central competent authority, as I mentioned, currently it is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. But according to this new bill, the central competent authority shall be the Executive Yuan's National Sustainable Development Network. They will coordinate across departments, and the meetings will be convened by the premier, who is the leader of the executive yuan. So obviously the governance for climate change will be elevated to a higher cross department level. Another focus of the new bill are the economic incentives. So we know that the market mechanisms in Taiwan, such as emission trading and offsetting mechanisms, are already being practiced. But in addition to that, it would be important to more generally collect carbon fees from domestic emission sources in accordance with the polluter pays principle. So we have more money available then for carbon reduction and to subsidize the low carbon technologies and industries. Last but most importantly, when it comes to the long term goal of reducing emissions, currently the goal is to reduce 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. But the new goal now is even more ambitious. So, following the example also of many other countries, Taiwan now pursues or is proposing the net zero emission target by the year 2050. So now we have to explain, what does net zero mean? The opposite of net is gross, and gross means total, the total emissions. The total emissions could actually increase. But in order to receive the net zero emissions, one trick would be to take advantage of modern technology, for example, carbon capture and storage, or create carbon sinks, such as forests that absorb the carbon dioxide or the emissions. In this way, the emissions then can be deducted. And then when we deduct, after the deductions, then it would be possible to achieve net zero emissions. So this is the trick here, yeah, to deduct, to take advantage of certain deductions, and then in this way achieve net zero emissions. And Taiwan has published an official blueprint for carbon reduction in March 2022, and it's called Taiwan's Pathway to Net Zero Emissions by 2050, where the specific strategies are explained, yeah, how we can reach net zero emissions by the year 2050. Question: what is the relationship between the Greenhouse Gas Reduction and Management Law and the Climate Change Response Act? What is the long term greenhouse gas emission reduction goal in Taiwan? Do you care about climate change? Give reasons for your answer. What do you do to help fight climate change? And what else could you do to make a difference in society? And as an inspiration or encouragement, I share this picture with you that says from zero to hero. So let us all become heroes. Yeah, let us all fight climate change as best as we can. And this is the conclusion now. Climate change is a global problem that needs a global solution. Taiwan's commitment to comply with UNFCCC agreements benefits the whole world and opens a door for closer engagement in the international arena. Since Taiwan plays a key role for global supply chains, while itself heavily relying on imported resources, a systemic transformation is necessary to ensure sustainable development. Remember, here I was talking about the arc. Yeah, so Taiwan should become more like an arc. Circular economies and low carbon societies must be implemented with modern technologies and the engagement of all stakeholders, including enterprises and citizens, in their everyday lives.
CIP is a project called Taiwan Climate Change Projection Information and Adaptation Knowledge Platform. This project is being developed and promoted by NCDR, and NCDR is National Science and Technology Center for Disaster Reduction. It is a public authority under the National Science and Technology Council. So they are part of of the executive yuan. And here you can see all the companies, the institutions, the universities that cooperate in this platform. And they do a lot of research. And here you can see some of the major results of this research. For example, regarding the number of hot days in Taiwan, you can see if we take adaptation measures and if we do not take adaptation measures, then the number of very hot days above 38 degrees will increase to 30 days per year. So can you imagine? In 1 year, it's about 1 month where it's extremely hot, not just 1 or 2 days, but 30 days, like almost a whole month above 38 degrees Celsius. Here you can see the number of drought, very, very dry temperature, no rain. Will increase to 20 days per year. And here you can see if we do not take any adaptation and mitigation measures, particularly here in the south, it will be extremely hot and dry. And we also know that each year we have several typhoons in Taiwan. And as a result of climate change, the number of typhoons will decrease. This is what you can see here. It will decrease. However, at the same time, when there is a typhoon, it will be extremely strong. So the intensity of the typhoon will increase. Taiwan is an island, so we are surrounded by the ocean. So when climate change becomes very severe, the impact for Taiwan will be the sea level rise. And here we can distinguish between two scenarios. So the first scenario is if we manage to keep the global warming around 2 degrees Celsius, then the sea level rise will be about 0.5 meters. However, if the temperatures rise to 4 degrees, then the sea levels might rise even more, up to 1.2 meters. Now, where is the risk the biggest in Taiwan? And the risk is biggest in the center and in the south of Taiwan. These areas are close to the ocean, and they are also located at the bottom level. So the risk of flooding is the highest in Taiwan. We are very lucky today. I'm very lucky today that I met Joyce. Yeah, Joyce, and she's now in Taiwan at the National Science and Technology Center for Disaster Reduction in the Climate Change Division. So she really is an expert for disaster prevention, especially when it comes to climate change. So, Joy, yeah, what would you like to share with us? How can we prevent the disasters?
Okay, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I have some knowledge towards this. But we have what we call the TCCIP platform. So if any of you are very interested in knowing more about the localized information and climate change trend in Taiwan, you can definitely visit this page. And then inside of this page, we have different type of information, including some of our latest series of AR6. When the IPCC had released their report on the sixth assessment report. And then we also have what we call the climate change data store. So if any of you are ever interested in like processing analytical data, you can definitely get some of those information here. But mostly, I think most of you will be more interested in some of the informative materials. So we do have those climate change column that you will be able to read based on what type of things or what type of part of life that might be affected by climate change. And we also have in the front page we have a podcast. So if any of you want to like listen to like 15 minutes of information on climate change, you can definitely listen, follow us on podcast, and then maybe you can get some information from there. So now all these are in Chinese, but later on, because upon the request of your teacher, I think we will be uploading more information in English.
So take a look at the homepage, yeah, and practice, do your part, do your contribution. Yeah. So here we see the different types of wind turbines. Yeah, we have different types. Those that are closer to the continent, yeah, to the island, you can see here these models, and these two models here are used where the ocean is deeper, where it goes deep down, and so they have to be more resistant. And the latest model you can see here is floating. Floating means that they don't have to be attached to the ground. And this kind of new technology is being developed, especially in Europe, but also in Taiwan. We are doing research on this latest type of technology. And as you see, the energy has to be transmitted first at offshore substation, and then to an onshore substation, and then finally it will be transmitted to the high voltage tower. government, the county government, cooperates with a private company, and together they develop a special technique to process the oyster shells. And then when it becomes this kind of material, then look at the products that they make. For example, they can make the pens, or they can make the textiles, the socks for consumer use. So all this is extremely innovative and environmentally friendly, and also for the climate. Great example for a company called Blue Seeds. This company was established 6 years ago and has received many awards. Here you can see for sustainable development, green product. So here we have the national awards and also some international awards. And it is also certified. You can see here the ingredients are cruelty-free, which means they don't use animal experiments. And you can see here the picture also taken at the presidential office. Last year they received the Golden Boat Award, also a recognition for their products. So what makes their products so special? They are natural. So they cooperate with some farmers in Taiwan, in the eastern part of Taiwan, and to produce these environmentally friendly, sustainable products. I was also asking regarding the motivation or the history of this company, and this company was established 6 years ago, and the founder of this company, she also had some allergies, so she wanted to develop some products that are more natural and don't harm the earth and are good for the people, for the environment. So this is the story and background of this company. Here we have a very special electric vehicle which was developed by a Taiwanese company, a stock-listed company. They spent 4 years developing this special vehicle, and it received the Taiwan Excellence Silver Award this year. So what makes this vehicle so special? Well, it's very environmentally friendly, it's quiet, it has almost no emissions, and most importantly, it can transport up to 200 kilograms of products. For example, some enterprises like the Panda that delivers the food in Taiwan, they already use this vehicle. parking spaces are still left, including in the next 1 hour. And this will save you a lot of time, and also save a lot of CO2. Because the fact is that most people drive the car around looking for a parking lot, and this will be very climate friendly then. According to the international climate agreements, reducing the climate temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius is critical. And you know that Taiwan, like many other countries now, even pursues a higher goal, namely to reach net zero. And this is the long-term goal to be reached by 2050. And here you see how much time, how many days are left until 2050. And you see the clock is ticking. There is really not much time left. So let's all do our best.